This lecture is on the circulatory system, or we should actually say systems, because a circulatory system is any organ system that is involved in circulation, and circulation would mean the movement of substances through tubes, such as the cardiovascular system, which consists of the heart and blood vessels. The blood vessels would be the veins and the arteries, which are going to carry the blood from one place to another in the body. And then the heart is the pump, a way of getting the blood through the blood vessels. Then another circulatory system that we have in the body is the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is also a system of tubes called lymph vessels, which carry lymph. And they return the lymph to the blood vessels. That's their job. And lymph is a fluid. Doesn't look like blood. You probably would be most familiar with lymph if you've ever gotten a blister and then popped the blister and you've seen that clear fluid coming out. Lymph is basically fluid that is excess buildup in the tissues that the lymph vessels then return back to the blood. But also as part of the lymphatic system, you have the lymph nodes which edit the lymph. And so that means that they take harmful pathogens out of the lymph, such as anything that could possibly cause disease. Well, let's start talking about the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and blood vessels. That's the majority of this lecture. So to begin with, we have to consider the heart, which is an organ that's about the size of your fist. It's located in the thoracic cavity, and it is sort of more over toward the left side of the thoracic cavity, behind the sternum and within the rib cage for protection. And in fact, the left lung is actually a little bit smaller than the right lung, and that accommodates the heart being sort of pushing over towards the left side. The heart is also surrounded by a fibrous sac called the pericardium. And the pericardium is a protective layer, but it also secretes fluid. And that fluid allows the heart to expand and contract. Remember, the heart is made of heart muscle, and so the heart is going to beat. It's going to pump blood, and this fluid that's secreted by the pericardium allows for there to be less friction when the heart expands within the sac and contracts. Let's get an overview of heart anatomy shown on the next slide. So we're looking at the anterior view of the heart in this picture. And so in this picture, it's going to be as if you are looking at a person. And so you're looking from the front at a person looking back at you. And so this would be really the front of the heart, and drawing these blood vessels entering and leaving the heart, because the heart is going to pump blood, so blood has to get in and out of the heart. And this is the outside of the heart. So you can see lots of blood vessels on the outside of the heart. These would be the coronary arteries that are feeding the heart. And the thing you have to realize about the looking at the heart from an anterior view is that if the person is looking back at you, then the right side, or their right side, is on your left, and their left side is on your right. And that's going to be true of any anatomical drawing that you see. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So we've drawn the coronary arteries, and so we're labeling them the right and left coronary arteries. Now, coronary means crown, and so these arteries kind of circle the top portion of the heart like a crown. And when you get your heart and you're asked to put it sort of facing you, you're going to see the anterior interventricular artery facing you. And there's the apex, which is the tip of the heart. And now I'm drawing in fat, because you'll see a lot of fat on the heart when you do your dissection. So let's label some of these veins and arteries that are entering and leaving the heart. You have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And these are veins, cavernous veins. So they are very big veins. They are taking a lot of blood into the heart. Veins carry blood toward the heart. The inferior vena cava is bringing blood to the heart from the lower part of the body. The superior vena cava is bringing blood into the heart from the upper part of the body, the head region. Okay, then we have the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Okay, and the aorta and the pulmonary artery are both taking blood away from the heart. The aorta is going to take blood from the heart, and by the way, anything that's an artery is taking blood away from the heart. So the aorta is the largest artery in the body, and is taking blood away from the heart, and the pulmonary artery. So the aorta, when it takes blood away from the heart, it's going to take the blood to the head region or to the lower part of the body. When the pulmonary artery takes blood from the heart, pulmonary means lung, and the pulmonary artery is going to bring blood from the heart to the lungs. The heart pumps the blood to the lungs to be oxygenated. And we'll go over this again. Okay, and then you have the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins are on both sides because the pulmonary veins are bringing blood from the lungs, pulmonary, toward the heart. Veins bring blood toward the heart. So after the blood has been oxygenated in the lungs, it's then going to return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. And so you have the pulmonary veins from the right lung, and you have the pulmonary veins from the left lung. On this slide, we're going to look at the interior of the heart. So it's as if we're going to take off that front layer, cut it in half, and remove the front. And now we're going to look into the heart through the same view. And we're going to label the various parts of the heart that we see when we look at it through the anterior view. Okay, so we have the superior vena cava, which we mentioned, and we also have the inferior vena cava. And they are going to bring blood into the right atrium. Let's orient ourselves by putting right and left on the slide. Okay, so there's the right atrium, which is one of the 4 chambers of the heart. And blood from the right atrium moves into the right ventricle. And then I neglected to mention that the blood, when it goes from the right atrium, will flow through this valve into the right ventricle called the atrioventricular valve, or AV valve, which is also sometimes called the tricuspid valve because it is made of 3 cusps or flaps. And then blood will head from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen and then heads back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. We'll go over this again. And then it goes into the left atrium from the pulmonary veins. And then it goes through the bicuspid or mitral valve, another atrioventricular valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And blood will then go from the left ventricle up into the aorta. And the aorta is going to take the blood away from the heart towards the head and towards the lower part of the body. And so there are valves in the aorta, which with one valve called the aortic semilunar valve. Semilunar means sort of 2 half moons. And this valve has 2 flaps. And there's also a valve in the pulmonary trunk that leads to the pulmonary arteries that I neglected to mention. And that is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, so let's take this picture and go back and see the blue arrow that I'm drawing there. And let's use blue and red arrows to follow the flow of blood through this picture. Okay, so hopefully you've drawn a pretty good rendition of this picture, but let's take a look. Follow the blue arrow. So we have the deoxygenated blood coming into the right atrium through the inferior vena cava and also from the superior vena cava from the upper body, going into the right atrium and heading through the AV valve into the right ventricle. And so this deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle is going to go up through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries, where it winds up in the lungs, where it's going to then pick up oxygen. And when it picks up oxygen, the blood turns red because when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, which is the protein in blood that is carrying oxygen, that's a pigment protein, which then changes color and becomes red. And so the oxygenated blood is red, and it's going to return through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. And from the left atrium, the blood will go through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, the blood will head up through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And then from the aorta, the blood is going to go to the upper body and also head down to the descending aorta, or through the descending aorta to the lower part of the body. So let's take a look at what's controlling the heart. And so first you have to realize that the heart can beat on its own. So from very early on in the development of the fetus, right around the 3rd week or so, the muscle, the cardiac muscle that will eventually becomes the heart, just spontaneously begins contracting. And so the heart has its own pacemaker. Now, it can be up or down regulated by the nervous system. So as you know, once you start exercising, your heart starts beating faster. Or let's say you decide you're going to start meditating and your heart will then maybe slow down. Okay, so this is the regulation of the heart by the nervous system. But in this slide, what we're talking about is the heart's own control of itself. And so let's just take a look at that. And just remember that it can be up or down regulated by the nervous system, but this is the heart's own control of itself. Okay, so here's a picture of the heart with its 4 chambers, and just labeling them the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And up in the superior corner of the right atrium, you have what is called the sinoatrial node. And I'm drawing these, the nodes are these two yellow ovals, the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node, and then the electrical currents that they will generate is shown in yellow. So let's draw these things first and then we'll label them. So we have the sinoatrial node, which is the heart's primary pacemaker and is going to keep the heart beating at about 70 beats per minute. And it's going to send electrical signals to both the right atrium and the left atrium. And so these two atria are going to contract simultaneously, almost as if they're just one big cell. Okay, and they contract simultaneously under the control of the sinoatrial node, the heart's pacemaker. But there's a secondary node, which is called the atrioventricular node, and is sitting there between the atria and ventricles. And so this is one of the secondary pacemakers of the heart. And the sinoatrial node will send electrical signals to the atrioventricular node. And then the atrioventricular node will send electrical signals out to the ventricles. And these electrical currents are sent through these cells called Purkinje fibers. Okay, so you have to realize that the AV node and the Purkinje fibers are both secondary nodes. Without the sinoatrial node, if something happens to the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node will take over and will send electrical signals to the Purkinje fibers. Without the atrioventricular node, the Purkinje fibers take over. But they're only going to send electrical signals to the ventricles, so that could be or would be problematic. So just a little review of this slide. The SA node sends electrical impulses to the two atria, then they contract, and the SA node also sends electrical impulses to the AV node. And then the AV node will send electrical impulses to the Purkinje fibers, and that causes the ventricles to contract. So in unison, the two atria contract. There's a little pause while the electrical signal goes through the AV node to the Purkinje fibers, and then the ventricles contract. When the atria contract, they push the blood into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, they push the blood into the arteries, either the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, or the left ventricle is going to push blood to the aorta toward the body. Blood in the aorta either goes to the upper body or to the lower body through the descending aorta. So the atria contract together and the ventricles then contract together. And this leads to a cardiac cycle. That's what we're going to talk about on this slide. And in the cardiac cycle, the atria contract and then the ventricles contract, and then the heart relaxes, and then the cycle begins again. So when the atria contract, the blood flows into the ventricles, and then the AV valves close, and that creates a sound called lub, of the lubbed up. If you're familiar with the heart sounds, lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up. And that's due to the closing of the valves. Well, the lub is the AV valves closing, and the dup is the semilunar valves closing, but they haven't closed yet. Okay, so when the ventricles contract, the blood is going to flow into the arteries. So it's going to go up into the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries to the lung, or it's going to go up from the left ventricle to the aorta to the rest of the body. So blood's going to flow into the arteries. And then when the blood flows into the arteries, the semilunar valves will close, and that's going to create the dup sound. Lubbed up, lubbed up. And then the heart is going to relax. And so you have these terms systole and diastole. We're going to write here. So systole is contraction and diastole is relaxation. Now, systole refers to, they refer to contraction and relaxation of the heart in general. It could be either atrial systole or diastole, or atrial diastole, or it could be ventricular systole or ventricular diastole. But if it's not labeled as one or the other, then it's taken to mean ventricular systole and ventricular diastole. Okay, so systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. And so when the heart relaxes, it's in diastole. And when the ventricles contract, we say that the heart is in systole. If the ventricles stop contracting and you die, they call that asystole. Okay, so, and then another condition of the heart, since we're on this slide, we've been talking about valves, is a heart murmur. And so a heart murmur is when you have a problem with the valves closing. And of course, if there's a problem with the valves closing, then blood can move backwards. And you can have a minor heart murmur. Some of you may even have a heart murmur. And you can live with a heart murmur. Small amount of blood is going backwards, not really that big of a deal. But people who have a really dysfunctional heart valve will sometimes have to have a valve replacement. Okay, on this slide we're going to talk about blood pressure. Okay, so blood is going to flow through the arteries, and arteries lead away from the heart. Any blood vessel called an artery is leading away from the heart, and that means that these blood vessels are under a great deal of pressure because the heart is pumping, and they're the blood vessels that are closest to the force of the heart. And so we're going to draw a picture here of an artery, which is a very thick-walled vessel that consists of a connective tissue layer, a smooth muscle layer, and a layer of endothelial tissue. So there is the connective tissue layer on the outside, and then that is surrounding a smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is the muscle that's involuntary, surrounding organs such as the digestive tract and also blood vessels, as in this case. And then you have the endothelial tissue, which is an epithelial tissue, and it is the lining of the blood vessel the closest to where the blood is, which is in the interior of the endothelial tissue. And so the arteries, they're known for their strength and elasticity because they have to withstand the force of the heart pushing the blood through them. And in fact, you can feel the blood moving through the heart when you measure your pulse, okay, which is the stretching of the arteries as a result of the blood going through them. Okay, and then we're going to talk about measuring blood pressure. And so the blood pressure that we measure is the force of the blood through the arteries. Okay, so in this slide we're talking about the measurement of blood pressure. And for this purpose we use a sphygmomanometer, which consists of a cuff that is attached to an inflatable bulb. And the cuff, you can press on the bulb and the cuff will inflate, putting a pressure on the arm. Okay, so the sphygmomanometer is the blood pressure device. And depending on how much you inflate the cuff, can be measured by a gauge, which is measuring pressure in millimeters of mercury. And then a medical professional can listen to the changing force of the blood through the artery by putting on a stethoscope, which fits into the ear and then has a little cap or disc that is placed over the arm. And so to measure blood pressure, the first thing we're going to do is inflate the cuff to about 180 millimeters of mercury and then listen through the stethoscope. So if you've inflated the cuff to 180 millimeters of mercury, not going to hear anything because you've cut off the blood flow in the brachial artery. And so if you cut off blood flow, you're not going to hear anything. But if you gradually release the pressure in the cuff, then the blood is going to start to flow through the brachial artery. So brachial means arm. So this is the main artery going into the arm. And so we gradually release the pressure on the cuff, and the blood is going to flow into the brachial artery. Okay, and you hear these sounds, which are called Korotkoff sounds. If you're listening to the stethoscope, it sounds like a little ticking. And so that's once you've released the pressure, you're hearing the force of the blood through the brachial artery. And so this force is due to ventricular contraction or systole. And so we call this you should look at the gauge and see what is the millimeters of mercury at which blood begins to flow through the brachial arteries. We call that the systole. Okay, and then obviously those sounds are going to stop. And because the blood is going to then flow smoothly again, and we call that diastole. Okay, and so the measurement of blood pressure is systole over diastole. And for a typical person, it'll be 120 over 80. It's considered to be normal. If you exercise, then it's probably going to be something like 110 over 70. So it'll be quite a bit less. Your heart is stronger, doesn't have to work so hard, doesn't have to contract as much to get the same volume of blood out of it. But some people have what's called hypertension, which is chronic high blood pressure. And, realize that chronic high blood pressure can be genetic, but it can also be a result of stress and lifestyle and lack of exercise, smoking, and diet are all risk factors for hypertension. You want to be eating a diet that is relatively free of saturated fats, which come from animal products. Now let's talk about some other structures of the circulatory system, or basically we're talking about the cardiovascular system here, which is the heart and blood vessels. And so the next slide, we're going to talk about the capillaries and veins. The capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, and their endothelial lining is only one cell layer thick. This allows nutrients and gases to diffuse in and out of the capillaries, for example, in the lungs and tissues. And so in the lungs, oxygen is going to diffuse from the lungs into the capillaries. And also in the lungs, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the capillaries out of the body through the lungs. But then the capillaries will also carry the blood to the tissues, where the oxygen will leave the capillaries and the carbon dioxide will go into the capillaries. And also at the tissue level, nutrients are going to be leaving through the capillaries. So many different substances are diffusing into and out of the capillaries, and therefore their lining is very thin, okay, one cell layer thick. Okay, so here we have a picture of the arteries, which lead to arterioles or smaller arteries. So in the arteries you have great blood pressure, but once it gets to the arterioles, which are smaller, there's kind of there's a serious slowing down of blood pressure there, kind of a bottleneck. And the arterioles then lead to the capillary beds where there's delivery. And so now we're drawing the blood in blue because the oxygen has left the blood, carbon dioxide has entered the blood, and from the capillaries, those blood vessels lead to the venules, which are the small veins that lead to the big veins that go toward the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava. Okay, let's draw a picture of a vein. And actually, if you just look at the picture of the vein with its connective tissue and smooth muscle tissue and endothelial lining, it looks pretty much the same as an artery, except it's a lot thinner. The walls of veins are much thinner than arteries. They're under a lot less pressure than arteries because they're much farther away from the heart. And so they also, because they're under a lot less pressure, they have to get the blood back to the heart. That could be an issue. But veins contain valves which prevent backflow of blood. But they also rely on skeletal muscles to help bring the blood back to the heart. So the more you're exercising, the more you're using your skeletal muscle to get that blood back to the heart. Okay, so blood is going to go from the heart to the lungs and is going to go from the heart to the rest of the body. So we call this pulmonary and systemic circulation. Pulmonary means lungs, and systemic is referring to the body. So let's look at the pulmonary and systemic circulation on this slide. Okay, so the blood is entering the heart and leaving the heart and going to the lungs. And we call this the pulmonary circulation. And then the blood goes back to the heart, which is now oxygenated and is then going to leave the heart. Once the blood leaves the heart, we say it is going into the systemic circulation and is going out into the body. That is the systemic circulation. So pulmonary circulation is the lung, and systemic circulation is going to the body. And there are three subsystems of systemic circulation that we're going to talk about on the next three slides. Okay, so you've got the coronary circulation, which is circulation to the heart itself to feed the heart. You have the hepatic portal circulation, which is the circulation to the liver. Hepa means liver, and we'll talk about that. And then we have the renal circulation, which is the circulation that is going to the kidneys, because renal means kidneys. Okay, so let's take a look at all three of these. In the next slide, when we talk about the coronary circulation, we're going to see a slide that we saw in the beginning of the lecture. Okay, which is the slide of heart anatomy, but yet I'm writing coronary circulation on it. So in coronary circulation, why are we looking at this slide? Because we're looking at a picture of the heart, and we're looking at the coronary arteries, which feed the heart. Okay, and this is referring to the coronary circulation. Okay, these coronary arteries are bringing blood and oxygen and nutrients to the heart cells, so they are fed, so they can do their function to contract and pump the blood to the lungs and the rest of the body. One serious disease of coronary circulation is called atherosclerosis. And this is a disease that is due to plaque buildup in these blood vessels that can lead to a heart attack. And those plaques are usually caused by too much cholesterol and saturated fats. And this is a very good reason to be on a diet that is free of saturated fats. Anytime you're eating animal fat, you can pretty much guarantee that it is a saturated fat, with the exception of fish, which tends to contain more unsaturated fats, and oils. A saturated fat is pretty much anything that is solid at room temperature you want to keep out of your diet, because they can lead to clogging of the blood vessels that lead to the heart, and eventually prevent the heart from doing its function. And then in the next slide, we have the hepatic portal circulation. Okay, in this circulation, the digestive tract, which you put food in, the food is going to the intestines, and then the nutrients are taken into the bloodstream. Okay, and the nutrients in the bloodstream, these blood vessels, are going to go directly to the liver through the hepatic portal vein. And the liver is sort of a filtration organ. It does multiple things, but one of the things it's going to do is it's going to clean out the blood. It's going to take out pathogens and poisons from the blood and detoxify things that you ate that are not good for the body. And then it's going to send the blood from the hepatic portal vein to the inferior vena cava, which leads to the heart. That's the hepatic portal circulation. Okay, so the liver detoxifies the blood, removes pathogens and poisons. Another thing that the liver does is it stores metabolites like excess sugar and anything that you have too much sugar, it'll make into glycogen and store glycogen for a longer-term energy store. And it'll also remove waste, break down products of red blood cells, for example, that it'll send into the bile, and then the bile is going to the digestive tract and out of the body. And then in our next slide, we're going to talk about the renal circulation, or circulation to the kidney. And so the kidney is going to filter the blood, and you have two kidneys, and the blood is going to lead into the kidney through the descending aorta, which branches off into the renal arteries, and you can see them in red. And so blood is going to circulate through the kidney and is going to deliver oxygen to the kidney, because the kidneys need oxygen to do their job, and also deliver nutrients to the kidney. And then the deoxygenated blood is then going to enter back into the inferior vena cava through the renal veins. And so, but while the blood is in the kidneys are going to filter the blood and remove wastes. Okay, so, but they do need a large blood supply, and then through the renal vein, the blood will go to the inferior vena cava. So the kidneys are going to filter out wastes, and they form urine, which then enters these structures I'm drawing called the ureters. And the ureters carry the urine to the bladder where the urine is stored, and then the urine exits the body through the urethra. Okay, and so when the blood is going through the kidneys also take oxygen out of the blood, and the deoxygenated blood is going to go back to the inferior vena cava, as we mentioned. Okay, and then in our last slide, we've sort of talked a lot about the cardiovascular system, which is the main circulatory system of the body. But in our last slide, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system, which is a different circulatory system of the body. And so in the lymphatic system, I'm going to attempt to draw a picture here. And you have a person. You also have a system of circulation, lots of lymphatic vessels, or lymph vessels. And these lymph vessels are punctuated by lymph nodes. Okay, and you can see a picture of these nodes here. And so the lymph vessels, they are going to carry lymph. Okay, and lymph is a fluid. We talked about that. And that fluid is coming from the tissue space that has been forced out of the blood vessels through pores in the endothelial lining. And these lymph vessels, they come to an end, which is very different from blood vessels, which are in a closed circuit. So blood vessels don't end. They're kind of like a roller coaster, which keeps going round and round and round. But lymph vessels come to an end. They're more like roads that eventually come to an end. Okay, and the lymphatic vessels, what they're going to do is take up fluid from the tissue space, and then they're going to return the fluid to the blood vessels. Okay, so sometimes you see people that have very big ankles, maybe swollen ankles, because their lymphatic system is not functioning to bring the fluid back into the cardiovascular system, into the blood vessels. But lymph vessels do have valves that help them move lymph, and they also rely on skeletal muscle contraction to get the lymph to circulate through the lymphatic system and back to the bloodstream. And then the purpose of the lymph nodes is that they contain lymphocytes. Okay, we're going to hear more about lymphocytes when we talk about the immune system. But lymphocytes are cells that fight infection and get rid of pathogens. And we will hear all about them in a later unit. So that ends our lecture on the circulatory system. And thank you for listening.